That's so great with the that you have to agree with the recording. Okay. Good midday, everyone. Maybe I will just wait. Maybe 1 more minute. Okay. I think I will start. Yeah, so welcome everyone to our 1 hour lunchtime webinar that was organized by the EB, by ZOE Institute and SDG Watch Europe. And yeah, I'm very happy to see so many of you joining this discussion today to talk about the potentials and also the risks of the national recovery and resilience plans from a more systemic aspects. I'm Kati Wiese and I work for the European Environmental Bureau, which is one of the largest environmental umbrella organizations based in Brussels. So in terms of the agenda, we will first have like a quick welcome from Jakob Havele, who's the Managing Director at ZOE Institute for Future Fit Economies, and then from Patricia Heidegger, who's our Director of Global Policy Sustainability of the EB, and she's also part of the advisory committee from SDG Watch Europe. And we will then afterwards listen to the presentation of the results and the methodology of the Recovery Index for Transformative Change developed by NEF and ZOE. And then afterwards, we will have a discussion. Just briefly, in terms of Zoom netiquette, I mean, I know we all kind of know it by now, but please mute yourself when you're not talking. Please use the chat box for comments and questions. And for the Q&A discussion, you can also use the raise your hand function if you would like to speak out. And we would also really like to hear from you where you're joining from. So please use the chat to tell us the country where you're from and which organization. And with that, I would then hand over to Jakob Havele.
Thanks, Katie. So warm welcome also from my side, and thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. I'm pleased to have the opportunity today to introduce to you our work on the green recovery in Europe that looks at the national recovery and resilience plans. It has been more than a year now that we have all drastically changed the way we live. Most of us have stopped flying, we're commuting less to work, and we didn't have a proper social life recently. I, for instance, have been stuck at home most of the time, and I can imagine that for many of you, especially those with kids, this must be a really, really challenging situation. And I think many of us that are interested in protecting the environment, and I guess in this audience there are quite a lot, we would have hoped that this decline in mobility, but also the worldwide slowdown of economic activity would at least have had a big impact on global CO2 emissions. So let me show you a graph. What you can see here are the global energy-related CO2 emissions from 1990 till 2021. And despite the profound changes and restrictions of our movement, the impact on global CO2 emissions is unfortunately pretty small. Put in numbers, the International Energy Agency predicts a drop of only 5.8% in 2020 compared to 2019. And honestly, when I saw this the first time, I was really like, whoa, this really clearly shows us that we need to do much more than just flying less. And by no means I want to say that flying less does nothing or anything like that, but I think it's pretty clear that we need to do much more and that we need to seriously transform how our economies function. And you know, this doesn't look good for the future either, because the International Energy Agency predicts that the recovery from the pandemic could be the largest CO2 increase since the recovery from the global financial crisis in 2008, which you can see in this graph as well as the other small bump. And what happened back then is that the increase of CO2 emissions driven by the recovery were much higher than the CO2 decreases in the crisis. So the crisis, including the recovery, ended up creating more emissions then it's saved. And we actually now run the risk of repeating that. So this is bad news, I'm afraid. And the price for this is paid by our ecosystems. We are losing nature like never before because of unsustainable human activities. For instance, we saw a 68% decrease in monitored vertebrate species populations between 1970 and 2016. And you know, biodiversity is essential for life. If there are no bees to pollinate our plants, it's going to be seriously difficult to produce enough food for everyone. And not only that, nature provides us with medicines and health materials for creation and well-being. A healthy ecosystem filters our air and water, helps keep the climate in balance, converts waste back into resources, and much, much more. So it's very, very important that we actually help nature thrive instead of destroying it. And it's no wonder we're in this situation, because our economy rewards behavior that leads to such outcomes. Despite the very great efforts that have been made so far, you can still earn a lot of money burning fossil fuels or overfishing our oceans or cultivating monocultures. And believe me, we did a lot of research on this, and I can tell you that as long as our economy rewards these types of behavior, it's not enough to just invest some money into green infrastructure or more efficiency gains. What we really need to do is fundamentally change the goals for economic actors and reward behavior that helps nature and humans thrive. And I have good news for you also today. This moment of crisis that we are in right now started a process of collective reflection on what is important for our lives and how we want to live in the future. And that provides quite some once-in-a-generation opportunities, I would say, to seriously change how our economies function. So it is right now that we can actually go further than we did in the past and pave the way for the necessary systemic change. And what I mean by that is implementing measures that support economic convergence, foster social inclusion, while at the same time supporting nature to thrive and reducing power imbalances. So now comes the big question, how to do that? One of the once-in-a-generation opportunities that I've talked about are the 670 billion euro that are made available to member states of the European Union for the pandemic recovery, so through the so-called European Recovery and Resilience Facility. And based on the work we did on creating systemic change for a resilient Europe, I'm confident to say that there are already some signs of progress here. For instance, the EU Commission is taking some steps in the direction of pursuing a deeper transformation in the recovery by applying the new so-called do no significant harm principle. With that principle, every measure of the recovery plans of member states should be assessed against the environmental impact to limit measures that would harm our environment if implemented. So today's topic is whether or not that sufficiently translates into action at member state level and where we still see room for improvement. Therefore, we came up with a methodology to assess exactly that. Our recovery index for transformative change that we at ZOE have developed together with the New Economics Foundation. And I'm very happy that we can present the results of that to you today. So together with EB and SDG Watch Europe, we hope that our work on a holistic assessment of the recovery plans will inspire you to discuss how it can be used in your individual context. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction.
Hello, everyone. I think Kati froze there for a second, but I guess the floor is mine. So welcome, everybody, also in the name of the EB and SDG Watch Europe to our exchange today. So yeah, as you can imagine, both as the EB and SDG Watch Europe, we've been, well, not just following, but advocating around well, the setup of the recovery mechanisms and now the development of the national resilience and recovery plans with great interest, giving the size of the investments and the long-term expected long-term impacts of these investments and these measures. So we've been, ever since the recovery planning around the recovery measures started, I mean, we've been advocating to make sure that all the investments, well, as much of the investments as possible goes in the direction of the long-term transition, of systemic change, and benefits the economic transition that we want to see towards a more equitable and carbon neutral well-being economy. So as SDG Watch Europe, being Europe's broadest civil society network, bringing together many of the large EU-wide civil society networks working in all different kinds of issues and bringing together all different constituencies, from the youth movement to the women's rights movement, from organizations working on environment, social justice, human rights, development. We've been we issued a very early detailed statement on what a sustainable recovery, which is aligned with long-term sustainable development objectives, should look like. We engaged with several of the commissioners and the cabinets at the early stage of the discussions around recovery. And later on, once the member states started working on their plans, we also engaged with our national level membership to exchange what is happening at national level around the plans, to learn from each other, to alert each other of the developments at national level. As SDG Watch Europe, we've also been quite closely following the developments and the reforms around the European semester, which well, there's the promise that this instrument would be transformed from, you know, the narrow focus on growth and economic growth, and the kind of the slow integration of social indicators and you know, some greening, to really transform that instrument in a more holistic instrument to follow up on sustainable development in Europe, beyond that narrow focus on GDP growth. And now, given that the semester is so closely linked to the recovery measures, that has been also at our focus. Now, doing all that work, of course, we've been concerned by different things. I mean, first and foremost, we've been concerned by the fact that a civil society, we have not necessarily been consulted with very in a very transparent and open way, especially at national level, where many civil society organizations found it difficult to be invited to consultations, to be able to shape the draft the draft plans, and to have access to the policymakers. So that's something we've been following with a lot of concerns, and many of you have been participating to surveys and studies around that. Then, of course, we've also been concerned by the question, how green are these national recovery and resilience plans? As EB, we've recently organized an event, maybe some of you have participated to that, with some of our national level members to assess in how far the conditions are met to dedicate a necessary amount of the investments to climate and environmental investments. And well, what we found was pretty much a quite broad spectrum, quite different from country to country, but not necessarily satisfactory in any of them, but with quite some serious concerns in some countries. But then, beyond the question of how green are these plans, of course, is the wider question of in how far the investments and the measures taken really contribute to a long-term sustainable development, taking into account the different dimensions of sustainable development, beyond a narrow focus, let's say, on investments and carbon neutrality, or a few other well, environmental objectives. So as SDG Watch Europe, of course, we have an interest in finding out in how far the recovery measures go beyond yeah, kind of a siloed approach to dedicate, you know, some of the money to green recovery and some money to digitalization, but to really understand and how far these measures contribute to long-term and deep sustainability. And this is why we're very excited to discuss with ZOE today about your assessment, and to also discuss how your work, how we can eventually, you know, identify synergies between your assessments and the kind of political and advocacy work that we do at member state level and at European level. So thank you very much for your availability in sharing your work and your research, and I'm very curious to hear more now. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Yeah, with further ado, I would then like to welcome Elisabeth Diert from ZOE and Emmett Kibbett for the presentation.
Thanks so much, Katie, and also to Jakob and Patricia for the welcome. My name's Elisabeth Diert. I'm a senior policy consultant with ZOE, and I've been leading this work from our side, but it has been a strong collaboration between ourselves and New Economics Foundation. Emmett will speak a bit on their behalf in a minute, but I just wanted to take a moment to ground us and introduce our work before starting to dive into some of the details. Emmett and I will talk through, first of all, how we've done this and what kind of methodology we've used for this, and then also talk about some of our key findings. So as Jakob and Patricia have both said, we're all here because we're obviously in a really important moment and junction in history. The recovery and the scale of funding is really clearly an important opportunity that's going to set us on a certain pathway into the future. And with these plans, we start to see a little bit what pathway we're on. So this is what I will try to do today, is to share a bit of an overview of what the future looks like and what pathway these plans put us on and where we're headed. What trends do we see? And also, most importantly, where do we maybe need to adjust? Where do we need to concentrate energy to make some changes? Of course, as others have said, this is all in the context of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And I just want to start by saying that this facility is actually what they've done with the do no significant harm principle and the mandatory criteria with which to assess all of the funding, as Jakob already mentioned, is an important moment and a step forward to integrate environmental objectives into funding mechanisms. This is essentially forcing member states to make a multi-criteria analysis to assess the allocation of funding, and this is incredibly important and is a new and innovative approach. However, many of us are here today because we want to see something more than this, or we have critiques of this. And even though the do no significant harm principle is an important step forward, and in some ways it's actually a victory of what many of us have been working on for the last decades, it is an important step in the process towards finance being coherent across multiple societal objectives. And I just want to start by recognizing that. However, as someone myself who's been harking on policy coherence for the last decade, I want to recognize that this is really the strongest attempt by the EU that I've seen to do that in the context of allocating funding. And I would like to share also that in speaking to member states, as we were doing as part of this research process, the process of implementing this was a steep learning curve, but that there's really important capacities built at the member state level during this process that have the potential to have lasting impacts on how national policy is developed in the future. And these are impacts that all of us here can importantly build on in the future. So while recognizing that this is an important step, our analysis is trying to build on that and actually take one more step forward. As many of you know, we live in a world where there's not just ecological limits, which is importantly addressed through the do no significant harm principle, but we also have a social foundation. And this social foundation we need to care for in the recovery process, and we cannot focus on one or the other. And there are so many frames with which to do this. You can talk about donut economics and living within the donut. You can talk about the SDGs, and there's many, many more. But ultimately, the ecological transition that we need to have as part of the recovery process has social and needs social outcomes, and also the other way around. So we've taken this approach to our analysis because we think a deep transformation, one that tackles multiple and intersecting crises, like the climate crisis, like biodiversity loss, but as well like inequality, rising inequality, and our health crisis, that in order to tackle that, systemic transformation is necessary. Emmett is going to explain more about how we actually did this, but I just want to say one thing about what this means to us. In this analysis, we understand systemic transformation as meaning that measures incorporate both the width of change that's possible. So this means covering multiple sectors and taking a cross-society approach. This means pursuing policy coherence. It means pursuing co-benefits. It means taking a multi-outcome approach, but also diving deep into the root causes of the challenges that we face and consider how we do things, and that is just as important as what we do. So it is in this context that we developed our framework, a recovery index for transformative change. And Emmett will describe a bit what we analyzed. But before I do that, I pass over to Emmett, I want to say two key principles that have been important for us in this process. The first one is that we're not just here to critique, we're here to improve. We want this recovery to become stronger than what is currently in the plans. Our report, which will come after this webinar, doesn't just highlight what the problems are, but also what has potential and how do we improve some of these measures which do have problems still in them. And the second is we're on a longer term journey towards making systemic change palatable in policy arenas. And I fully recognize that this is complex, it's intangible, and sometimes it feels fuzzy. And in this work, we try to strike a balance between what's tangible, but also conceptually rigorous. So that means that this is a usable framework, as well as something that's innovative and ambitious. And I hope that you all also feel that we've struck this balance. So enough introduction from me. I pass over to Emmett to talk about the assessment process that we've done. Thanks, Emmett.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. Good to see everybody here today. So the methodology and process for this framework, we have the next slide, please. Yeah. The broad approach, I think, has already been outlined. And I think Jakob emphasized at the beginning of the session the need for taking this opportunity, this great opportunity with such a huge amount of funding to really achieve transformative change. And that was the thinking behind the framework generally. So the index differs from some of the other indices we think that are out there, which are also making really valuable contributions. They may be looking at primarily what's included in the investments and reforms. So criteria like, are they reducing waste or reducing emissions, providing jobs? We wanted to go a bit deeper and look at how these investments and reforms are structured, what form they take, and whether they are likely to lead to systemic change, the transformative potential, and potentially the risks as well, so against transformative change. The framework does this then through analysis in a number of sections. So we start with the width of change, what we define as the width of change, which is how many different aspects of change are addressed. And that falls under two categories: a just transition and the protection of the natural world. So Elizabeth's already spoken about how important it is for the transition to be just. The natural world, I think, was something we were concerned may have been overlooked or not given enough attention. So these were key priorities to build into the model. Then there's a section on systemic change criteria to understand whether the investments tackle the root causes. And then we assessed the whole plan level a bit more briefly, just to look at entire country plans and see which systemic interventions are addressed, which are not, and the coherence across the whole plan between different investments. So moving on to the next slide then. As I've just described, this is a kind of an overview picture of the framework. You see the component level in the top half, the width of change coming under just transition and natural world, and the depth systemic change, and then the plan level components. But I'm going to go into more detail on each of these now. So moving on to the next slide, I'll touch on our scoring system. We assessed the plans at the component level, and that means groups of investments in a given sector or with a given purpose, highlighting under just transition, natural world, whether there was particularly strong potential for it to positively impact the just transition or the natural world, or particularly strong risks. And so in these particular cases, we scored 1 for strong potential, -1 for strong risk. And it's possible for the same intervention to have positive potentials and risks at the same time, which might cancel each other out in the score. So this was a deliberate choice of scoring mechanism to really highlight the areas with particularly strong potential and risks, setting a threshold and below which we weren't drawing attention to particular areas. For systemic change, we felt it was more appropriate to have a graduated score from -1, which is a negative working against systemic change. That might be something which concentrates power, for example, 0 for no impact, or +1, 2, or 3 for positive contributions. At the plan level, then we assessed alignment with 12 key interventions for systemic change, scoring from 0 to 12. And we assessed coherence through a simple question of alignment and coherence between the different investments with a score of 1 to 3. So moving on then, what were the indicators under each of these areas? Well, under just transition, we had 5, and you can see them listed here. Social protection for workers and communities was very important. This is about enabling a good quality of life, preventing poverty during the transition, including potentially that through investments that provide social infrastructure that meet local needs, and maybe training and skills investments for affected workers. The next criterion then is resilient local economies. This was looking at investments that would score well if they were locally specific, creating an economy that's not over-reliant on one sector, and an economy that provides strongly in the foundational economy sectors, the sectors that we use every day. That might be our utilities, our transport, our health and education. The third criterion then was on job creation. Very important through this investment. It should create jobs, but not just any jobs either. We defined jobs for resilient societies as green sectors, and we wanted to broaden the definition beyond the traditional green sectors that you hear about, installing solar panels, retrofit, etc., and look at jobs that are inherently low carbon. So that might include social care, that might include health education, the arts. These can be green jobs too. They don't directly drive the transition, but they can exist in a green economy. The fourth part of this then, social dialogue, was all around investments designed in ways that give citizens a say in decisions that affect their lives. And then the final component, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Investments that would have strong potential under this would recognize and address historical and structural inequalities. So be they based on a person's gender, their ethnicity, the region within a country, their age, disability. So moving on then to the natural world criteria, we had 4. The first one looks at biodiversity conservation. So this is a familiar definition. A strong potential here was around investments and reforms that protect the abundance and diversity of flora and fauna in a place. Under nature-based solutions, we looked at investments that address societal challenges in a way that improves human well-being, but also facilitates improvements in nature. Under the third criterion then, it was around connecting people with nature. And this was looking at investments that could remedy poor social behaviors towards nature, things like pollution, but also build stronger connections. I think we've all appreciated the importance of connections with nature during the pandemic. And finally, under climate change action, this was just defined simply around climate change mitigation of emissions and adaptation to climate change. So moving on then to systemic change. And our thinking around this drew on a piece of work that is cited at the bottom of the slide, The Water of Systems Change, which in turn was drawing on academia and extensive research in this area. The way they defined it in their framework was that there are 6 conditions of systems change. They range from those at the top, the more explicit, so that people can see this in change, they can see changes in policies, practices, to the more implicit further down, changes in power dynamics, relationships, and the most implicit being changes in our mental models, the underlying ways of thinking about the world. And the key point here is that the more implicit conditions of systems change are very important to make the change stick. So often we address the explicit, but not the implicit. And we may see a change in practice in the short term, but it doesn't lead to a long-term systems change. So reflecting the importance of these implicit criteria, we gave a heavier weighting to them in the scoring. So an investment or reform could address the explicit conditions, but it would score much more highly if it effectively addressed power dynamics, mental models, and relationships and connections. So moving on to the next slide then. This is just a summary of what I've presented. You can see the 5 criteria under just transition for a natural world, and 4 with 3 of those bundled into 1 under systems change. So on the following slide then, just to summarize how we approach the whole plan level, we were drawing on a recent publication that ZOE worked on in collaboration with NEF and the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And this was an extensive literature review of systemic change as a whole, and it identified 12 clusters under which systemic change interventions should lie. And these relate to policy and governance, they relate to finance, business, and citizens. And there's more information in that report. So we were using that as a basis for the whole plan level. So moving on to the next slide then. Yeah, the general approach, we assessed 13 countries. We feel we got quite a good coverage across Europe. We scored at the component level, as I've already said. There were quality assurance procedures to make sure, the results were robust. So we had a common assessment guidance document across the team. We assigned assessment by sector, with each person taking the same sector across different countries for consistency. But each assessment was also reviewed vertically by country. So each component was reviewed by at least 2 people. So the scoring system, as you've seen, provides an indicative sense of strengths and weaknesses with qualitative detail notes on the rationale behind the scores. Like all qualitative frameworks, there is some subjectivity that's unavoidable. We felt the best approach here was to be transparent in our assumptions where we have been subjective. And just on the interpretation of the results then, we do know that plans have different levels of funding and detail to each other. Countries have different starting points. So the scores aren't directly comparable or meant to be ranked precisely by the number that came out. And in keeping with this, we've reported a color spectrum of, a traffic light, green, amber, red, rather than a numbered ranking to just draw attention to strengths and weaknesses rather than quantitative scoring. So finally then, just to show you an example on the next slide of some of the outputs. This is the kind of thing that we generated for the German plan as an example. You can see the width of change under just transition and natural world, just transition in blue, natural world in green, under the different components. So in this case, we had components on climate-friendly construction and refurbishment that scored very well for potential to lead to just transition and potential to have positive impact on the natural world. But there are similarly risks inherent in some of these that are shown on the left. And Elizabeth will go into the findings in more detail. And just on the final slide then, showing the systemic change scores for the German plan, you can see that the elements around climate-friendly construction, again, scored quite positively on potential to have systemic change, whereas there were others that scored negatively. That one is reduction of investment barriers, and it may have reinforced existing mental models or power balances and scored negatively for those reasons. But I'll hand back to Elizabeth then to come into some of the findings.
Thanks so much, Emmett. And just to start by saying the 2 graphs that Emmett shared will make up one component of what we will publish as country profiles. So coming not next week, but a little further down the line, we intend to publish the data behind and a small analysis behind every country that we've analyzed. And this will be available on ZOE's website, likely in 2 weeks' time, starting to produce those. So we included these graphs also so you can get a bit of a snapshot of the data that we will publish in the future. Lydia, can you bring me 2 slides forward? Thank you. So I will start to dive into our analysis now. And as I think Emmett may have mentioned briefly, we did a sectoral approach to the analysis. Rather than going country by country, we first went through per sector to do an analysis across, and we thought this would lead us towards having an overarching picture of what the state and the trend looks like across Europe for a particular theme, topic, sector, etc. As those of you who've been following the RRF really closely, you'll know that the EU has outlined a number of pillars as well as a number of flagships. And in this chart here, you can see how the different sectors that we broke down align with the various flagships and pillars. So this is then a key kind of reading guide if you're looking at both the guidance and legislation from the RRF in comparison to our analysis. Lydia, if you can take me to the next one. So I will just talk us through at the sector level and some clustered together, some of the key overviews and overarching findings that we had from our research and from our analysis. So I will start, I have 2 per slide, and I'm going to go through them and try to go through relatively quickly while also giving some examples so that you have some tangible evidence to get a feel for how we came to these conclusions. So the first is on social policy, obviously an essential part of COVID recovery. And as probably doesn't surprise anyone, there was a huge amount of improved and expanded vocational training, apprenticeships, education, and particular heavy emphasis on skills for the digital transition. And this was present across all countries. We also saw a lot of measures which strengthened active labor market policies, but this can be seen in both positive and negative light. So this has potential as well as risks. Some examples of the potential of strengthening active labor market policies across the plans include programs which work to support and include people with disabilities in the workforce. This was seen in the Portuguese plan, as well as specific programs to combat youth unemployment. There were very strong examples of this in the Italian plan, where they integrated youth employment opportunities across all of their different components to offer a wide spectrum of entry-level positions and graduate training for young people to improve youth unemployment. There's also some risks associated with this. So for example, in Poland, we saw measures to increase the pension and retirement age, as well as additional barriers created to access to social welfare programs across a number of plans. Related to energy, the whole picture across Europe places a very strong emphasis on hydrogen technology. And we would say an overemphasis on this as an essential renewable in a mix of renewables in our future energy grid. There's also a particular problem here, which is that hydrogen isn't always impact-free, and that really depends on what kind of hydrogen is being used. And there are for sure weaknesses across a number of plans about what kind of hydrogen is being implemented. There's also a question of what does hydrogen replace, and what is it taking on in terms of the energy grid mix. There's also both positive and negative tensions around the energy transition. So we saw a very good example in Spain, where the plan combines closure of coal plants with additions of new sources, with new community energy programs, with gender mainstreaming across energy included in the energy investment and reforms, with reskilling programs, particularly for workers that have been wedged out in this process, and also with a landscape approach. So looking also at biodiversity, nature conservation, and the impact on the ecosystem where this energy transition is taking place. This was a particularly strong example. There's also negative examples. So for a negative tension that we saw is then in Slovenia, where there's again discussion of replacing coal energy. However, it looks in the plan that this is going to be replaced by a large-scale hydroelectric plant, which has had large-scale opposition already domestically and has been contested significantly already. In addition, there are no social programs to support and no social aspects to support people and workers and communities that are part of this transition. Across the board, our energy, the energy measures that we saw really did not take their impact on nature and biodiversity seriously enough. And this should have been accounted for in a do no significant harm assessment, which was required by the Commission. And this was particularly lacking by many Eastern European countries. My next 2, Lydia, please. Thanks. So connected to energy is, of course, the built environment. And in the built environment measures, which was again a prioritization, a heavy priority in the flagships outlined by the Commission and the guidance for the recovery programs, We saw energy efficiency measures take a really front and center role here. This is of course encouraged by the Renovate flagship, and there's a really heavy emphasis on targeting large public buildings. This was also a good way to integrate modernization of public administration. However, any energy efficiency measures really needed to be combined with targets for reduction of emissions as part of an energy efficiency renovation or construction investment. These two things need to be strategically combined in order to reduce actual emissions, and often energy efficiency measures on their own do not end up reducing emissions to the same extent that we would hope, and with that you need also targets or reforms. And we did not see the strategic combination as much as we really needed to see. There's also the challenge, which is that the delivery of renovation funding varies, and that also has an implication for how this can be distributed across society. So for example, there's a big difference between how a tax break or grant for efficiency renovation can be received. And there's a particularly negative example in Italy, where there's tax credits which are very strongly privileging high income groups and property owners. And there's no then allocation for lower income groups in terms of energy efficiency renovations. There's of course a recurring goal and outcome of job creation in the construction in the process of this, which is traditionally the case. However, again, connecting to the impact on the natural world, the potential for nature-based solutions in the built environment was largely underutilized and really not often taken up. Connected to the other topic on this slide, there was really not enough embedding of circular economy practices across both built environment as well as digitization. This should have been taken account of in a do no significant harm assessment, but largely speaking across almost every plan, there wasn't the embedding of these practices the way that we need to see a real transition to circular economy across Europe. So in digitization, again, a very heavy emphasis on this in the guidance from the Commission. And as you can imagine, this really, we can see the digital transition coming through the investment in this. There's increasing access, there's increasing training, there's increasing equipment, there's increasing infrastructure. And we see some really good examples of attempts to increase digital access to rural communities. One notable example is Latvia's last mile policy, which focuses on then rural communities and this the last mile, the last segment to smaller communities to get good broadband access, for example. There's also particularly strong examples in Austria's plan around a focus on broadband connections and digital access outside of urban centers. However, in order for the digital transition to be inclusive and not leave members of society behind, there really needed to be much more focus on who is left behind when you digitize education and you do not have access for the equipment needed to do this. And there was a really there lacked the social dynamic of digitization and the issue of inclusion for socially disadvantaged groups to have access to digital equipment to be able to participate in a new digital economy or online education or online skills development. There's a particularly problematic lack of examples on disability access because that requires specific equipment for people who might be visually impaired or hearing impaired. One positive example of this, I would say, is actually in Slovakia, where there's a particular focus on training and equipment access for elderly people in rural communities to be able to participate in a new digital society and have the kind of access and inclusion. One significant gap that we saw here, which relates to the potential climate impact of digitization, is that no plan that we assessed actually considered the increase of energy use for the digital transition. When we have more and more people participating in education online, participating in businesses online, having more and more digital equipment, really no one considered the waste that comes from the end of life cycle of this equipment, as well as the increase in energy use from this. Lydia, can you take me to the next two, please?
Elizabeth, just quickly, because we're already like 1:45 to 2. So yeah, maybe if you could sum up some of the next points that we have just.
Yes, I will go a bit faster.
Okay, sorry about that.
Indeed, those were also the ones with the most funding allocated to them. So there was the most emphasis put on them. So there was the most amount there. So I would just go quickly through these last couple. So related to health, there was quite a heavy emphasis on minimizing regional disparities and reducing social inequality and access to healthcare, including, again, connection to renovation of facilities, digitization of healthcare, and improvement of social services, and particularly long-term care. Related to business and industrial policy, again, lots of investment going into particularly enhanced focuses on the green transition, the digital transition, and there we saw some emphasis on circular economy. However, industrial policy needed to also focus much more on targeted support for the economic transitions that are happening, in particular around job losses. And there's a really big gap around the anticipation to add automation and mechanization to improve economic outcomes without any consideration for job losses. And I would point out Poland as a particularly weak example of planning for what happens to people working in industries that are undergoing mechanization and automation. Lydia, bring to the next one, please. Or I think I skipped one. Yeah, sorry, if you don't mind to bring me back to biodiversity and mobility, and I'll finish there. So as we've mentioned before, there was really little recognition of the role and value of biodiversity and nature in the plans. Very little recognition of the interconnectedness between social, economic, and environmental outcomes. And I will leave it there because I want to come back to the do no significant harm principle at the end. And I would just say one last piece on mobility, and then I would come to summarize some of the important pieces here. We really saw this technology focused and car focused and road focused investment in mobility rather than a systemic transformation in how people use transport systems. There was a big missed opportunity to deliver mixed modal systems which reach beyond capitals, and very few countries which focused on prioritizing and expanding public transport systems. Italy and Austria being two notable exceptions, which also then aligned environmental, social objectives with their transport programs. Lydia, if you can bring me to the summary slide. So I will just wrap up here on our overall reflections of the process. The first is that the do no significant harm principle is an opportunity to integrate environmental impacts, and this was largely underutilized. The assessment from member states needed to be much more rigorous and needed to be much more evidence-based. In particular, it was missing biodiversity and nature impacts, as well as circular economy impacts across every plan that we read. This needs to be done much more rigorously by member states, but also this needs to be assessed rigorously by the Commission when they are assessing the plans. Looking into the future, it would be our suggestion that instruments like this are mainstreamed across other funding mechanisms, but that capacity needs to be built to do this. The second key conclusion from us, or key reflection, is that ultimately the devil is in the detail here, and there's the potential for every single one of these measures to be improved when it comes to implementation. We as a community need to be ensuring that environmental and social impact assessments are still complied with, that national legislation and strategies are still complied with in this process, and that in addition, many of the plans outlined that there are additional consultation and participation possibilities coming down the pipeline when it comes to drawing out implementation. And this is then something that we can all have an eye on for where to input into the future, and when it comes to detailing out and operationalizing these plans. The last thing is that we would really encourage a different narrative about what economic recovery means and looks like, and that this is then a holistic and systemic approach to this, rather than something that focuses only on returning to a certain level of GDP growth, as is the ultimate North Star for many of the plans, as is outlined from the semester process. I will leave it there from the presentation, and when we wrap up, talk about the next steps. Sorry for taking so much time. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, Emmett. It was really interesting, and I already look forward to read the report afterwards. So now we have still a few minutes left for discussion, and we thought maybe a first discussion round could be about your approach and methodology, and then maybe another round questions like how can we maybe better work together, or how can we as civil society use the results in our work. So I saw a question from Nick, but I think that was already addressed from Emmett. Does anyone have any other questions, maybe first on the approach or the methodology itself? You can raise your hand or also flag that in the chat. Maybe there are no questions about the methodology. Maybe it was all clear for everyone. Does anyone else have questions or comments, like how we could work together or how we could use these results in our work? Or any ideas around that? Everything is welcome.
Could I just ask, did I understand correctly that the report per country will be, sorry, should have I stacked instead of just jumping in?
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Did I understand correctly that the report, including information per country, will be released in a couple of weeks' time?
Yeah, so we have a summary report which will be available either the end of the week or Monday, and then we will have country profiles which we will put on our website, and we will release these as soon as they are ready. I can imagine it will be another week before the first one of these are ready, but you can expect these to be available, yeah, perhaps in 2 or 3 weeks' time. And this will then have the country data as well as some of these details that I've talked about per country.
Thanks. Then I have a hand from Jeremy and also a question from Inge in the chat. If you will also still assess the other ones that are coming in. But yeah, maybe you can address this after Jeremy's question.
Yes, hi everyone. Thanks a lot. This is very interesting, in particular for us, because we have been involved in the Spanish assessment, and we're also doing a similar review, mainly on policies within the Green Economy Index. Yeah, so I had two comments. First, I think it would be interesting from your assessment to separate what's coming out from the reforms and what's coming out from the investments, because those are two different pillars, and sometimes we are very good at assessing investments, but sometimes it's more important the reforms than the investments. So I think that would be interesting. And also another point I would like to suggest, maybe it is already in place, but I would recommend to get a feedback from national NGO, national experts, or whatever. Because sometimes when you do such assessment that are very macro, you are missing, or you could miss, or you could interpret some specific policies or investments in a way that could be different from what is coming out from the field. So if there is opportunity, and I'm sure within the EEB community or other communities will be happy to support you to get to share feedback before it is released, or maybe on a second version when you do a first release, but then you make sure that you do integrate comments from national experts. And it is what we are doing within the Green Economy Tracker, and it is very helpful to improve the quality of the work. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Maybe you can take this question, and maybe Inge, if you would like to speak afterwards, because you had several questions, and then afterwards I also have another one from the chat box.
Yeah, so I think once we get out the country profiles, we would very much welcome input from national level from national organizations such as yourself that have been working on this. I would say that we are also doing this project in a broader consortium, and within that there are a number of national partners that we've had contact with, although this has been stronger in the context of the Eastern European countries than others, although we have had meetings across a number of specific member states, but this is then from the government's perspective and not necessarily from those critiquing it. So I would welcome very much to have conversations and feedback on our country profiles once these have been published. Thanks.
Just to answer that question on investments and reforms, the component level is the lowest level we went to, and a typical component might include, for example, 3 investments and 2 reforms. So we couldn't separate further than that. However, you know, the whole plan assessments might say something more general about investments versus reforms. There was a question in the chat that was similar. I think, yeah, the components line up with the sectors. So that was where we determined the sectors originally from what kind of components we were seeing in plans. And that's how we split it up.
Thanks, Amit. Yeah, Ingrid, do you want to quickly ask it?
No, I think for time I would not want to dominate that here. The methodological thing was in the chat, and I think that requires a bit going into it. I was actually wondering the difference between the scoring, which has these nice graphs and here and there, and then the interpretation, which comes, of course, again, quite aggregated. So I'm just looking forward to the country profiles and that report, and maybe we can get together again. And the second was on the country selection. Apparently those who had delivered, and the question whether you will continue with the others, which then also leads a bit to the question, who is funding all this? Is there a particular interest somewhere where we could then plug in maybe with the future joint work? As Patricia said, we are definitely behind that, so looking forward to that.
Thanks, Inga, and I'm happy to pick up afterwards about the methodological question or discussion. Very glad for that. On the topic of country selection, and actually I wanted to address the question from Diana in the chat. So indeed, we had an initial vision of having a spread of countries across Europe so that we had every region and various sizes and all of this represented. As many of you know, not all countries have released their final plans. And so then we adjusted this based on which final plans were available first. So some we traded out and some we didn't. And then in the end, we selected based on trying to have still a regional spread and still a difference in size, so that we had something that was a bit representative of the whole picture. We do not at the moment have the intention to continue to assess the new ones as they come out. Also partly because it's really been our goal to assess the final plans. So that we're really looking at what has gone to the Commission. I just want to note that the Romania topic is a little bit of an exception, where they released their plan, communicated it that it was their final plan, and have since released something otherwise. And this is because there's a couple of countries that have had this back and forth with the Commission when they've released their final plan, and the Commission has advised that they weren't adhering enough to the criteria and that they needed to make some revisions before an official final plan was submitted. That's my understanding of that situation. So we've done, we did Romania's assessment on the understanding that was the final one. I hear that maybe there's another version that's come out. And so if that's the case, then maybe we would correct the analysis to make sure that we've got the final version. But that's a particular isolated circumstance. Otherwise, our assessment has really been on the published final through Parliament going to the Commission plans.
Thank you very much. I see that it's already almost 1. So there's a last comment from Jeremy in the chat. Yeah. Also kind of in appel, I think, to work together. So before I will hand over to Elizabeth, I just also wanted to thank you all for joining this discussion today. And sorry to be a bit over time, but I think there's a great interest, and I really hope that we continue this discussion. Yeah, when you have to report, how we can then maybe more effectively use the results together.
Thanks, Katie. So I will cut my closing very, very, very short. Lydia, if you could bring up just the very last slide. I want to just acknowledge everyone that was a part of this process. So this team was quite big, both from, this one, thank you. The team was big, both from the side of ZOE and the side of NEF. And as you can imagine, this was a bit of a sprint for us to get through all of the final plans very quickly to this point. So I just want to say thanks to everybody that was involved in this. And the very last thing that I want to say is I want to share just one input that was shared with me actually from a contact when we were having our meetings with member states as part of this research. And she said, and this was someone that's sitting in the environmental ministry in one of the member states that we had a meeting with, and she said that what we need to keep in mind in this process is that the long term and the short term start on the same day. And that in the end, in order to respond to a short-term crisis and an immediate crisis that's in front of us, like what the pandemic is the challenges the pandemic is presenting us with, we also need to start the long-term transformation that we're on at the same time. And that's what we are trying to achieve now, and hopefully push ahead with this work. So from my side, thanks for joining, everyone. Thanks for the thought-provoking conversations, and very happy to follow up with anybody after this call. And thanks, Katie, for hosting us.
Thanks. We will also share the presentation and the slides, and then we can also use maybe this mailing list for people that are interested to receive the report. Then, yeah, have a really nice sunny afternoon to all, and thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.